and time, now Yenpie, where you're from to France. Go ahead tonight, you have it, and you're by chance, so you're bar, but someone can't show. And I say, they will find new, and through this time, they will have full mood.
Hello, and welcome to episode 23 of Afrikanists Assemble. This month, we invited our pool of contributors to share their perspectives on fieldwork from their various fields of study. Here's the question we asked them. What do you think is an aspect of fieldwork in your discipline that too often gets overlooked? Let's see how many different answers they came up with.
What is an aspect in linguistic fieldwork that often gets overlooked? I actually don't want to answer that question concretely. I've been to Africa to do fieldwork at least once every year since 1987. And I've taught field methods courses many times. I've supervised many students who did fieldwork. Every time it was different. And every time it was very exciting. Always something was overlooked. That is unavoidable. In a way, doing fieldwork is like driving a car. You can learn it by doing it, not by reading from a book. An instructor can watch and tell you what to do and what not to do, and you forget about that when you drive on your own and develop your own driving style. Everyone develops their own style in fieldwork, and all are good. The most important aspect for me of fieldwork is that you need to analyze on the spot, because only then new questions can be addressed. This needs time and sometimes a little bit of distance. And the best fieldwork conditions are those where everyone is happy, not only the speakers you work with, but you too. So do it and be happy.
Ajụjụ nke agba bụ gịnị ka ị chere bụ akụkụ nchọcha a na-apụ apụ eme nke ọtụtụ mgbe a na-eregharịkarị anya na ngalaba ihe ọmụmụ gị? Nchọcha a na-apụ apụ eme abụghị nke a na-anọ otu ebe eme. Ọ na-abụ usoro nleta, mmekọrịta, nghọta na nchịkọta data gbasara mmadụ, omenala na ebe obibi nsinachi. Ebumnuche ya bụ ịhụta n'onwe gị ihe ndị ị chọrọ iji mee nchọcha n'ihe ọmụmụ gị. Usoro a na-esi emekarị ya bụ site n'ịnọ ebe a na-eme nchọcha, ịnọ na isonye n'ebe a na-eme nchọcha, ịgba ajụjụ ọnụ na ajụjụ ederede, nsonye nchọcha bamiri abami nke agbụrụ dị iche iche ya na nnyocha mmadụ, ọnọdụ ma ọ bụ mmemme. Ngalaba ihe ọmụmụ m bụ ntụgharị, ya bụ isi n'asụsụ Bekee tụgharịa ederede gaa n'asụsụ Igbo ma ọ bụ si n'asụsụ Igbo gaa n'asụsụ Bekee. Ezigbo onye ntụgharị ga-amarịrị opekata mpe asụsụ abụọ ma makwara omenala asụsụ abụọ ahụ nke ọma. Echere m na akụkụ nchọcha a na-apụ apụ eme nke ọtụtụ mgbe a na-eleghakarị anya na ngalaba ihe ọmụmụ m bụ ịnọ ebe a na-eme nchọcha, ịnọ na isonye na nchọcha ya na ịgba ajụjụ ọnụ na ajụjụ ederede. Ịnọ ebe a na-eme nchọcha. N'usoro nchọcha a na-enweta data site n'ịnọ ebe a na-eme nchọcha ma ọ bụ site na mmadụ na ebe obibi nsinachi. Ịnọ na isonye n'ebe a na-eme nchọcha. N'usoro nchọcha nke a, ọ bụghị naanị na onye nchọcha na-anọ ebe a na-eme nchọcha, kama ọ na-esonyekwa na nchọcha ahụ. Ịgba ajụjụ ọnụ na ajụjụ ederede. Ndị a bụ ajụjụ ọnụ ma ọ bụ ajụjụ ederede nke a na-ajụ ndị mmadụ mgbe a na-eme nchọcha. Ihe ndị m chere na-akpata nleghara anya nchọcha ha na-apụ apụ eme na ngalaba ihe ọmụmụ bụ aghọtaghị mkpa ntụgharị dị. A na-eletu mkpa ntụgharị dị anya ma chefuo na ntụgharị na-eme ka nzirịta ozi ma ọ bụ mkparịta ụka dị mfe ma mee ka ụwa niile bụrụ otu. Enweghị ego amawapụtara maka ime nchọcha. Ọtụtụ mgbe, ma ndị otu mba ụwa, gọọmenti obodo mba Naịjirịa na ndị na-emepụrụ ndị mmadụ enweghị ego ha na-amawapụta maka iji ziga ma ọ bụ kwado ndị na-eme nchọcha na ntụgharị. Mpụ, iri ngarị na ịma mmadụ. Mgbe ụfọdụ, enwere ego mmawapụta maka nchọcha, ndị isi na-ekeri ya ma ọ bụ hapụ ịkpọrọ ndị nọ na ngalaba ihe ọmụmụ ahụ, kama ha kpọrọ ụmụnne ha ma ọ bụ ndị na-ekwere ha njọ na mma. Nsogbu nke oge. Ọtụtụ mgbe, oge amawapụtara maka nchọcha anaghị ezu iji mee nchọcha n'uju. Enweghị ngwaọrụ eji eme nchọcha, enweghị ndidi maka onye nchọcha, enweghị mmasị ime nchọcha. Mgbe ụfọdụ, ma ego ma ihe ndị niile a ga-eji mee nchọcha ga-adịcha, mana gọọmenti agaghị enwe mmasị itinye ego n'ime nchọcha. Ndewonu.
What do you think is an aspect of fieldwork in your discipline that is too often get overlooked. The environment. The environment impact in fieldwork is often overlooked. It may not even be seen as important if the research field is not linked with it in any way. But environment do have impacts on fieldwork directly or indirectly, either on the work or on the researcher. Another aspect is comparative advantage. This could be between two arguments, view, or material of value. Although it's not often overlooked, the overlook often comes from extra costs, and except the researcher is originally comparatively focused. If considered, it will help to determine value, and value forms aspects of the fieldwork. Thank you.
An aspect of fieldwork that too often gets overlooked in my discipline is performance. Well, that relates to oral literature in transition. That's to say that there are new forms of orality, and usually whatever happens in oral performance or oral tradition is often accompanied by performance. And most times when you find literary critics analyzing oral works, they focus more on the text, the wordings, and they ignore the performance. The performance is also very important in driving home the message. Any performance of, let's say, poetry, for example, is incomplete, especially if it's oral poetry, without facial expressions, without gestures, without clicks, and certain paralinguistic attributes. Therefore, if ways or means are devised to capture these performative attributes, I think it will make for a richer analysis of any kind of oral literature. And that's why I am in support of especially poetry in the digital media, where it appeals to the audiovisual senses. And that way, more and more people would get the message better, and it will form part of the analysis. Sometimes the words alone are incapable of reaching to the heart of the message, but whenever it's accompanied by physical performances, it makes it better and makes it more lively.
What is being overlooked actually in the field, in my area of study, is actually what the researchers go through. I think there is so much concern, so much put in place for respondents to make sure that they are protected, data protection, the information that is being given, which is good, very perfect. But little or nothing is done about the researchers' state. Sometimes some topics are really risky. You come across as a threat sometimes when you ask some questions in the field, and we have no idea what could happen. And apart from physical risk, there is also emotional trauma that comes along. When you get to listen to people's traumatic stories, it comes across to you, it gets to you too as a researcher. If I look at my case, when I get to talk to women, hearing their stories, hearing the marital stories, what they went through in their homes, what they went through in the hands of their in-laws and other women, sometimes it gets back at you as a researcher. You could be traumatized by all of this, putting down the stories. You're affected. But I feel like nothing is done about it. Nobody checks on the researcher. How are you? Are you physically okay? Are you emotionally fine? Putting down those things, are you traumatized? Recently, I've just heard about testimonies of researchers who have been traumatized, who are actually being depressed by maybe some of the things they get to hear. The processes of just being a researcher on its own is not as easy as it may sound, and they go through all of this. So I think if this could be looked into, where researchers are also sorted after, they are being asked after, just to know how they are doing, just to make sure that they are strong and doing well. Yes, sometimes PhD mothers, PhD fathers do this, but we also need it to be something that I think it should be made known out there that being a researcher is not as easy as it sounds. They need attention to, they need to be protected to. The same like the respondents or the same like the interviewees are being protected. Their data is being protected. Their images are being protected. Let the researchers be protected too. Let us ensure they are doing fine. Let us ensure that their emotional state is just okay. Thank you.
Well, what I think is an aspect of fieldwork in my discipline that is too often overlooked, well, I think there is an aspect, and that I would like to talk about it. Oral literature in Africa, is always not successfully taught without going to the field. And most times when students or even scholars go for fieldwork, the focus has always been on the object that provoked the trip in the first instance. Let's take the case of the panegyrics. A field study that seeks to collect proverbs or panegyrics would have the field worker getting his interpreters and performers to give what he wanted, and he collects them and then goes back, often missing a much larger information-bearing areas of indigenous thought, such as philosophies, aspirations, and histories of the people whose panegyrics he has collected. Wokari, my university's host community, is an aristocratic society spanning hundreds of years, dating back to the ancient Kwarafa kingdom. Panegyrics and aristocracies have common grounds, and when we went to collect these oral products, we just collected what we wanted, the panegyrics, and left. But with hindsight, now, I believe we would have done better, like expanding the scope of our collections to include the philosophies and the history of the Wokari people. I understand that the flip side of this sort of expanded venture is that the field worker delves into what is not immediately important to him. But we must be encouraged that these extra areas supply vital information that would make explications of the panegyrics easier. So for me, focusing on philosophy and history of a people when collecting other oral products should be encouraged amongst field workers in oral literature.
Kwenye taaluma yetu ya masomo ya fasihi, hatuna sana fieldwork hasa, yaani utafiti wa ziada. Na mimi nadhani hali hiyo inaleta ukosefu fulani. Naona kwa kawaida, mwanafunzi ama mwalimu wa fasihi, kama akisema nina mpango wa kwenda kwa mwandishi fulani, kwa mazungumzo fulani yanayohusu sanaa, mpango wa namna hiyo unafahamika kwa mpango wa taaluma nyingine, kama masomo ya anthropolojia na sio ya fasihi. Ama ni jambo extracurricular, yani la nje. Lakini utafiti wa ziada umenisaidia sana. Kwa mfano, mnamo mwaka 1996 nilipata nafasi ya kumtembelea mshairi mwenye hatibu Mohamed, mshairi maarufu wa Tanga, Tanzania. Na kwa bahati nzuri na ukarimu wake mwenye hatibu, niliweza kumuuliza maswali mengi kuhusu mashairi ya Kiswahili na kumsikiliza. Maelezo yake kuhusu uzuri wa mashairi na yakumbuka sana mpaka leo, na yalikuwa kama msingi wa ufahamu wangu kuhusu vipengele fulani vya mashairi ya Kiswahili. Mwenye hatibu alizungumzia ndege wa aina fulani wanaokwenda juu ya ngombe. Halafu akasema hivi, akasema, yule ngombe ana nguvu sana na anaweza kufanya hivi au anaweza kulala chini. Yule ndege akakimbia. Lakini hapana, yule ngombe ametulia tuli kabisa. Sasa kama wewe ni mshairi, pale unachukua mawazo. Yule ndege anakula kwa taratibu hapa, na ngombe hampigi yule ndege. Huyu anakula na yule anatibiwa. Ndiyo mashairi namna ile watu wanapenda. lakini kwa wanaojua mashairi. Mashairi hayana msingi mpaka shairi liwe lina kitu linasema. Basi fikra za mwenye hatibu zilinisaidia sana kuelewa utungaji wake wa mashairi, lakini pia zilinisaidia kufahamu, tuseme, maana ya maana katika mashairi ya Kiswahili. Na kwa maoni yangu, tunahitaji utafiti wa ziara, yani fieldwork, katika taaluma ya masomo ya fasihi, na sio fieldwork ile ya maktaba tu, lakini ya kuendea watu pia.
This month's question can be considered in different ways, but as a feminist linguist and as a disputant on matters relating to gender, equality, equity, and fairness to all, I will say that though feminism seems to have been over-examined, some polemics have been overlooked, especially the ones that work against the aim of the ideologues. One of such is in the sensitization of women, the treatment of other women. While it is true that societies we live in, especially those in the African continent, are patriarchal with male hegemony in place, the feminist continuous contestation for the attainment of equity in gender balance will only be achieved where the female folks understand that, to a large extent, it is the she who keeps herself in the place she occupies. She is the victimizer of self, what feminists generally will refer to as the victim, victimizing the victim. Blames are usually shifted to others than looking at the female inwards. For instance, it is a female who calls another a prostitute for attempting to get involved in governance, in politics, and other things that takes out outside the domestic sphere. It is the female who is a side chick to a married man. In the Nigerian parlance, a side chick is one who dates a married man, thereby victimizing her fellow woman who is a wife. It is the woman who refuses to be meaningful to herself and the society by being a stay-at-home mom or wife. It is the same woman who will tell her female children to be in the kitchen, to work, do domestic work, while the males sit in the parlor to watch TV or go out to play football. This, for me as a feminist, creates gender imbalance among and between the children. They are endless, if you ask me. The woman is the one who builds her self-worth, and if she builds her self-worth, she will not blame anyone for her inadequacies. There are various ways we can venture into this field work, because for me it is more of a society sensitization campaign than writing articles in journals that most of these people will not be able to read and understand. That is an area we have overlooked.
This week's topic and title is a very interesting one. It is to take a look at what I think an aspect of fieldwork in learning Yoruba that is too often overlooked. What will that be? One of the things about language learning is recruitment of students. And there have been a lot of articles written about how to do it, how to promote the learning of Yoruba language as a foreign language. And one big issue that we've looked at is we survey and sample students who come to the class. We ask them why they have come. We ask them what they feel comfortable about learning, and go through all of those things that somebody who's already made it there. And I've been wondering ever since then that what would it look like if we went into the field and were asking those who did not come to our classes why they have not thought about taking Yoruba as a foreign language. I understand why they would go to Spanish and they would go to Japanese and they would go to Chinese or even go to Swahili class, because some of them think if you take Swahili, you can go for safari. And then there are scholarships and sponsorships for the other languages like Spanish, like French, like
Japanese and so on. But there are no sponsorship and scholarship for most of the African languages. So I would like to know and survey those who do not come to our classes. And even maybe those of you who are listening to the sound of my voice to ask you, why have you never considered taking a tonal language like Yoruba, a language that has a worldview that is different from most Western languages, and one that will dip you into that field of understanding how you as a person learn? That is one aspect of a field work in learning Yoruba language. The pedagogy is well researched, but the promotion of the language itself amongst the Gen Z generation is one of the things that will be interesting to look at. I think we can assume where the millennials will not come to our classes, but why will the Gen Z not come to learn Yoruba language?
So, what's interesting about my discipline, which is philosophy, is that in its dominant definition, which is Western centric and is thought of as a discipline that originates in ancient Greece, a tradition that has been appropriated by Europe as kind of a discipline of Western origin and conducted mainly in Western languages, European languages, the dominant idea has been that this is a discipline that in fact does not feature fieldwork. And fieldwork as such in the Western tradition has been the prerogative of anthropology, right? So philosophy envisioned itself as not fieldwork based and anthropology as kind of prevalently fieldwork based. This is a very interesting question for me because then, I studied mainly in the tradition of European philosophy, and then I moved to African philosophy for my PhD. And there is strong arguments made by African philosophers why fieldwork is important for philosophy, but why they want the fieldwork to be done by philosophers and not anthropologists, because of the kind of negative association with the discipline of anthropology as associated to the colonialist project and to objectifying portrayals of the African continent. So this question of fieldwork is key when we talk about philosophy, and especially when we talk about African philosophy. And what I've come away with is actually through my study of African philosophy, I have come to believe that fieldwork is a very important component for all of philosophy, right? So the point is to how to kind of learn this from the African philosophy experience and bring it back also to the European Western idea of philosophy, because fieldwork makes philosophy more interesting. It makes philosophy richer, but it has to be done in a way precisely that is breaking with negative traditions of doing kind of ethnographic work in a way that objectifies the people we engage with, right? So I think my discipline, philosophy, has a key, crucial role in facilitating this reflection on fieldwork.
I am in literary studies. It isn't just that there is an aspect of fieldwork that is overlooked in my discipline, but rather that fieldwork itself as a methodology is overlooked in my discipline. When I embarked on my doctoral studies a few years ago, one of the things that I had to discuss in detail with my supervisors is my methodology. I had proposed to do research that comprised oral literature fieldwork. Half of the texts I was going to work with are oral texts that I was yet to collect. The other half, of course, was written texts that were readily available. And so we had to discuss this because oral literature fieldwork or fieldwork of any kind is not very common in literature. it is not the norm, it is the exception. And the worry is there is very little supervision that is available in the field of literature for young researchers who choose to do fieldwork as a component of their research. I remember being so worried at the time that I may be forced to leave out a very important part of my research because perhaps there will not be enough expertise to guide and handle me. Luckily, I was able to find that my supervisors could handle my work and could guide me sufficiently, but still the worry is in my cohort, I was the only one who did fieldwork as part of my research. And so in my discipline, generally speaking, fieldwork methodology as a whole is quite sidelined and is not very common. I'm happy that in the course of my research, I was able to show the importance of fieldwork because I managed to collect very insightful and rich material that I otherwise would not access if I had relied only on literature that is available, that has been published and printed. And so I was able to show that fieldwork is a component that we can incorporate into literary studies and literary research. But until now, I can safely say that it's still not very common and it's still quite sidelined as a methodology in general.
Those were all the contributions we received in response to this question. How do you feel about their takes on fieldwork? For instance, those of you in literary studies, do you agree with Annamarie's and Jacky's perspectives? Or those of you in gender studies, what do you think of what Emmanuella and Blossom had to say? Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Afrikanists Assemble. We post a new episode every month with questions meant to challenge and invite conversation from our contributors. Make sure you subscribe to see what kind of questions we cook up next. See you around.
Down for